At exactly 5:30 on the morning after Thanksgiving, my phone showed 14 missed calls. I counted them twice because I didn't believe it the first time. I was standing in my kitchen in a small town outside Asheville, North Carolina, with a mug of black coffee going cold in my hand, watching the sun come up over the ridge behind my property. The house was quiet, except for the tick of the old stove clock, and my knees complaining about the cold. Then, the phone started buzzing again, walking itself in a slow circle across the counter. My daughter-in-law, my son, my daughter, all trying to reach me within the same 10 minutes. The strange part wasn't that they were calling. The strange part was that I'd been expecting it since August. Have you ever spent your whole life being the answer to everyone else's problem, and then one day decided you were done answering? Have you ever given so much for so long that the giving itself became invisible, like it was just weather, just something that happened, not something anyone chose? For 22 years, I paid for every single family gathering my children and their families ever asked for. The rental houses, the caterers, the flights, the just this one thing extra that always turned into 3 more things. And somehow, every single time, I was still the one who came up short. This year, I decided to change exactly one thing. And by 5:30 the morning after Thanksgiving, that one small change had turned into something none of them saw coming. Before I tell you what happened on that call, tell me something. Where are you tuning in from tonight? I like knowing how far this reaches. And I want to ask you something else. Something I wish somebody had asked me 20 years ago. Has your own family ever treated your love like it was a subscription service? Something they could just expect to auto-renew every year without ever saying thank you? Let me know in the comments. Because what happened that Thanksgiving morning didn't start that week. It started months earlier, and nobody but me saw it coming. My wife Carol passed 11 years ago. Cancer, quick and cruel the way it sometimes is, gone in 4 months from diagnosis to funeral. My son Marcus was 31 at the time, married to a woman named Renee, and my daughter Patricia was 28, dating a man she'd later marry named Doug. Losing their mother knocked all of us sideways, and in the wreckage of that first terrible year, I made a decision. I told myself that Carol would have wanted the family to stay close, to keep gathering, to keep the holidays alive no matter what. So when Renee suggested that Thanksgiving move to a big rental house up in the mountains instead of my place, a fresh start, she called it, somewhere that didn't have Carol's ghost in every room, I agreed without much thought. Grief makes you agreeable in ways you don't notice until years later. That first year in the rental house was actually good, simple even. A modest place with 4 bedrooms, everybody pitching in for groceries, Marcus grilling on the back deck, Patricia's laugh carrying through the walls the way it used to when she was a girl. For a little while, it felt like we were healing together instead of apart. That's how it started, at least. But grief has a way of curdling into entitlement if you're not careful, and I wasn't careful. The next year, the rental house needed to be bigger, because Renee's parents were joining, and shouldn't everyone have their own bathroom? The year after that, it needed a hot tub, because Patricia said Doug had had a hard year at work and deserved to relax. Then it needed a private chef, because cooking for that many people was too much stress for a holiday. Every year the requests grew a little, and every year I said yes, because saying no felt like betraying the promise I'd made to myself in that terrible first year without Carol. The house payments went from $600 to $4,000 over the course of a decade, and nobody ever seemed to notice the number climbing except me. It wasn't just the house, it was the gifts too. When my grandkids were small, they wanted bicycles and board games, and I loved buying them, loved watching their faces on Christmas morning. But somewhere around the time they hit their teenage years, the requests changed shape. My grandson Tyler wanted a gaming laptop, the expensive kind, the kind that costs more than I made in 2 weeks back when I was still working the plant floor. My granddaughter Ashley wanted a designer handbag one year, then a content creation setup the next, whatever that meant. Marcus and Renee stopped asking what I could afford and started forwarding me links. Patricia and Doug started mentioning, very casually, in the family group chat, exactly what the kids were hoping for, like it was information I needed, rather than a request I could decline. And the strange thing was never really the money. I'd worked hard my whole life, retired with a decent pension from 38 years at the plant, and I had it to give. The strange thing was how little came back the other direction. If the weather turned bad on the drive up, somehow that was connected to me, because I'd picked the location. If the chef's turkey came out dry one year, I heard about it for weeks. If a bedroom wasn't quite big enough, or the Wi-Fi was slow, or the drive was too long, there was always a way for the complaint to circle back and land, gently but unmistakably, in my lap. I told myself families squabble. That's normal. That's what families do. I told myself the grandkids would grow out of the entitlement once they got older, got jobs, understood what things cost. I told myself next year would be different. Next year was never different. What finally cracked something open in me wasn't a single blow-up. It was a quiet moment, 3 Thanksgivings ago, standing in the kitchen of that rental house, washing dishes by myself, while everyone else sat in the living room, laughing at something on the television. Nobody had asked if I needed help. Nobody had asked if I was tired. Nobody, in fact, had asked me anything at all that whole weekend except one question, repeated in various forms by various people. Is everything set for next year? That was it. That was the entirety of my family's curiosity about me. Not how are you sleeping since your mother died, Dad? Not are your knees still bothering you? Not do you ever get lonely out there on that property by yourself? Just, is everything set for next year? I stood at that sink, with soap up to my elbows, and understood, really understood for the first time, that I had stopped being their father somewhere along the way. I had become their events coordinator, and that realization sat in my chest for 3 more years before I did anything about it. Last Thanksgiving should have been the one where things finally turned around. That's what I told myself while I was writing checks for the rental house deposit, the caterer's deposit, the extra deposit for the outdoor heaters Renee wanted for the deck. By the time everyone arrived, I'd put just over $11,000 into 4 days in the mountains. And truthfully, the money wasn't even the part that stung. What I wanted more than anything was to watch my family enjoy each other's company one more time the way we used to before Carol died. For the first few hours, it almost looked like that might happen. The house looked beautiful. The caterer had done a full spread, turkey and ham both, and the smell of it filled the whole downstairs. The kids were running around outside in the last of the fall light. Marcus and Doug were arguing good-naturedly about football. For a little while, I let myself believe we'd get through a holiday without anybody finding a reason to be disappointed in me. I was wrong. After dinner, Tyler unwrapped the early Christmas present I'd bought him, since we wouldn't all be together again until spring, the gaming laptop. The expensive one, the one I'd driven 40 minutes to the next county over, just to find in stock. He turned it on, and it froze up during setup. Just a software hiccup, the kind that happens with brand new machines all the time. But Tyler's face changed immediately, and within 30 seconds he was holding it up like evidence in a trial. "Grandpa, this doesn't even work." I told him it was probably just updating, that these things happen with new electronics, that we could call the store Monday. He looked at me like I'd handed him a broken promise instead of an $1,100 computer. "You spent all that money and it doesn't even turn on, right?" The room went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet right before somebody says something they've been holding on to for a while. Renee set down her wine glass. "Honestly, this is sort of on brand, Dad." I asked her what she meant by that. She gave a small, tired laugh, the kind that isn't really about humor at all. "You always cut some kind of corner. It's like the effort runs out right before the finish line. Cut a corner." After $11,000 on a trip none of them had ever once offered to help pay for. Before I could get a word out, Patricia added her own piece. "It's honestly kind of a pattern with you, Dad. Something always goes a little bit wrong." The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they were new, but because I'd heard some version of them for years and had always found a way to swallow them quietly. This time, something in me didn't swallow. While the conversation moved around me, I looked at the room, the caterer's dishes, the rented heat lamps glowing on the deck, the wrapped gifts still under the small tree Renee had insisted on buying fresh every year, instead of reusing one. All of it paid for by a man they seemed to have forgotten was actually sitting in the room with them. Not their father, not somebody's husband who'd lost his wife and was doing his best. Just the account the whole operation ran on. The conversation drifted on. The way these things do, somebody refilled a wine glass. Somebody put music on. The kids went back outside. But I sat there with something settling into place inside my chest that wouldn't move back out. For years, I'd told myself I was buying us a family. What I understood, sitting in that kitchen chair with a plate of cold turkey in front of me, was that I'd only ever been buying access, and even the access came with a bill I wasn't allowed to mention. Later that night, after everyone had gone up to their rooms, I sat alone by the unlit fireplace in the living room with my dog Bo, an old golden retriever who'd been Carol's before he was mine, resting his head on my foot. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't ask myself how to make next year's Thanksgiving go better. I asked myself a different question entirely. What would happen if I simply stopped? Not stopped loving them, not stopped calling, not stopped showing up, just stopped being the account the whole operation ran on. The answer came to me slow, and then all at once, the way real answers usually do. Next year, they would get exactly what they had actually paid for, which was nothing. Before I go on, I want to hear from you. After a dinner like that, would you have kept writing the checks? Comment below, keep paying, or walk away, and tell me why. Because once that thought took root in me that night by the fireplace, there was no talking myself back out of it. By the time September rolled around, I had almost let myself forget the promise I'd made to Bo in the dark living room that night. Almost. Then the family group chat woke back up, the way it always did, right on schedule. It started the same way. It started every year, a few messages about dates, somebody asking who was bringing what, and underneath all of it, the quiet assumption that a holiday was about to be arranged by a person nobody intended to ask for permission or gratitude. Renee posted first, a link to a rental listing, a bigger house than the year before, up near Boone this time, with a hot tub and a mountain view and a note that said, "This one looks perfect, don't you think?" Not a question. Not really. Just a formality dressed up as one. A few days later, Marcus started dropping links of his own, a new fishing rod he'd had his eye on, a smartwatch for Renee, a request for Tyler's laptop to be looked into since apparently it still froze sometimes, as though that were a debt I still owed. Patricia joined in not long after, with questions about the caterer. Could we get the same company as last year? Could they add a raw bar this time? Doug had been wanting oysters. Nobody in that chat, not once, asked who was actually going to be paying for any of it, because in their minds, that question had been settled 22 years earlier and never needed revisiting. Me. As always, me. The old version of myself would have spoken up right then, would have typed out some careful, hedging message about the budget, would have absorbed the mild irritation that followed and paid anyway, because that's what I'd always done. This time, I did none of that. I didn't argue. I didn't agree. I simply put the phone down and went outside to split firewood, something I hadn't done in years, and found I still remembered how. Weeks went by. The messages kept coming. Nobody seemed to notice that I wasn't responding, or if they noticed, they filed it under the same category they'd always filed my silence. Dad's handling it. Dad's got it covered. Dad always comes through. 22 years will train a family to stop asking questions they already believe they know the answers to. As October moved into November, the emails started arriving. The way they do the rental company wanting the balance paid, the caterer wanting a deposit confirmed, a note from the outdoor heater rental place about a pickup date. I read every single one of them. Then I closed my laptop and went to feed the chickens I'd started keeping since I retired, something else that was only mine, something nobody in that group chat had ever asked me a single question about. Meanwhile, I was making plans of my own, small and quiet ones. I called up an old army buddy of mine, Walt Pruitt, a man I'd served with back in the early 80s and hadn't seen face to face in almost 6 years, though we talked on the phone most Sundays. Walt had a little cabin down near Chattahoochee, nothing fancy, 1 bedroom and a wood stove and a dock out back where you could fish if the weather cooperated. I told him I wanted to come down for Thanksgiving this year, just the two of us. Maybe some catfish and a couple of old war stories nobody else wanted to hear anymore. Walt laughed and said it was about time I remembered I had a life of my own. I booked the days off from my volunteer shift at the VA clinic, packed a bag, loaded Bo into the truck, and told absolutely no one in my family where I was going. Unlike the mountain rental, this trip would actually get paid for, and paid for happily. The morning I left, driving south with Bo's head hanging out the window and the radio playing something low and easy, felt strange in a way I hadn't expected. I kept waiting for my phone to buzz with some kind of demand, some last-minute request that would somehow become my responsibility to solve from 3 states away. Instead, there was nothing. Just road and pine trees and Bo's ears flapping in the wind. Walt's place turned out to be exactly what he'd promised. Small and a little run down and completely, blessedly quiet. We fished in the mornings when it wasn't too cold, played cards in the evenings, and talked about men we used to know. Some of them gone now, some of them we'd lost track of decades ago. Bo slept most of the days away in a patch of sun on Walt's porch. Nobody asked me to fix anything. Nobody asked me to pay for anything. For 4 straight days, nobody needed a single thing from me at all, and I realized somewhere around the 2nd day just how long it had been since that was true. Thanksgiving morning itself came in cold and clear over the water. Walt and I fried a turkey out back the way his father had taught him 50 years earlier, and we ate on paper plates at a card table looking out over the lake. And it was, without question, the best Thanksgiving I'd had since Carol was alive. But I'll admit I kept glancing at my phone through the afternoon. Not out of worry, out of something closer to certainty. Because I knew what nobody up in Boone knew yet, that the balance on that rental house had never been paid, that the caterer's deposit deadline had come and gone 3 weeks earlier without a word from me, that the heater rental had quietly been canceled for lack of payment. So, while Walt and I sat with our coffee and let the afternoon go long and lazy, I found myself checking the clock every so often, because I had a fairly good idea of when the truth was scheduled to arrive. At exactly 5:30 the next morning, the calls started. I was up early, the way I always am now, sitting on Walt's dock with coffee and watching the mist come off the water while Bo dozed beside me. My phone lit up first with Renee's name, ringing, then stopping. 10 seconds later, ringing again. Before that one ended, Marcus's name appeared, then Patricia's, then Renee again. Within a few minutes, the screen looked like some kind of alarm going off. Call stacked on top of call. Texts arriving faster than I could have read them, even if I'd wanted to. I set my coffee down on the dock beside me and just watched the notifications climb. The first text from Renee read, "Call me right now." The second one wasn't any warmer. "Where are you? Nobody can find you." A minute later, Marcus sent something in all capital letters that I didn't bother reading closely. Patricia's messages were different from the other 2. Confused first, then worried, then something closer to frightened. I finally opened one of the voicemails, and the shape of the situation became clear right away. The rental company had turned them away at the door. No balance, no reservation, no house. Around the same time, apparently, the caterer's van had never shown up, because there had never been a confirmed deposit to show up for. No turkey, no ham, no raw bar with Doug's oysters. Just a driveway in the mountains, a locked front door, several suitcases, and 11 people standing in the cold, trying to understand what had happened to a holiday that had run itself for 22 years without a single hitch. The messages kept coming, more desperate by the minute. Renee wanted answers. Marcus wanted somebody to blame, and it wasn't hard to guess who. Patricia wanted a solution, fast, because the kids were cold and hungry and asking questions. What struck me most, sitting there on Walt's dock with the mist burning off the lake, was that every single message assumed the exact same thing: that I would fix it. That somehow, even after months of silence, even after every unpaid invoice, even after driving 400 miles in the opposite direction, their very first instinct was still to reach for me, the way you'd reach for a light switch, expecting it to simply work, because it always had. I could have called back right then. I could have gotten on the phone and found them another rental within the hour. I still had the connections. I still had the money. I still had the reflex baked into 22 years of habit. That was exactly what the old version of me would have done, and done gladly, just to make the noise stop. Instead, I picked my coffee back up. Walt came out onto the dock with a fresh pot and asked if everything was all right, and I told him it was, actually, the most all right it had been in a long time. I sat there and watched the phone keep buzzing on the dock boards beside me, call after call, text after text, and let it go on buzzing. Because sometimes the loudest thing you can say to somebody is nothing at all. And that Thanksgiving morning, the silence coming off that lake said everything I needed it to say. If you've ever learned the hard way that gratitude doesn't grow on its own, you might want to stick around for the next story, because there's more where this came from. And I want to ask you this: what would you have done in my place? Would you have answered right away? Or would you have let them stand out there a little longer and figure it out themselves? Close to an hour later, I finally answered. The second I picked up, Renee started in before I could even say hello. Not talking, exactly, more like demanding. "Dad, where are you? What is going on? Why isn't the house ready?" Before I could get a word in, Marcus's voice came in over hers, tight and clipped. "This is unbelievable. We're standing outside in the cold with the kids. The rental office says there's no reservation on file." Patricia sounded worn thin underneath it all. "Dad, please, just tell us what's happening." For a moment, I just let the line sit there. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because it was the first time in longer than I could remember that any of them had actually sounded like they wanted to hear from me, rather than hear a solution out of me. When the noise finally settled, I asked one simple question. "Did any of you pay the rental company?" Silence on the other end. I asked a second question. "Did anybody confirm the deposit with the caterer?" More silence. Then Renee, quieter now. "That's not really the point, Dad." I almost laughed, because it was the entire point, the only point that had ever mattered. I looked out over the water, took a sip of coffee that had gone lukewarm, and gave them the only answer I had left in me. I figured whoever wanted the house would be the one paying for it. Nothing. Not a single word came back down that line. For the first time in as long as I could remember, none of them had a comeback ready. No complaint, no excuse. Because we all understood, all at the same moment, what the truth actually was. Not one of them had ever expected to pay. They had expected me to. That's what they'd always expected, and for 22 years, they'd been right to expect it. I told them then what I probably should have told them years earlier, back when Carol was still alive to help me find the words. I told them I hadn't ruined their Thanksgiving. Nobody interrupted me this time. I told them I had simply stopped financing it. I explained, as calmly as I could manage, how every single gathering over the past 2 decades had drifted further from being about each other and closer to being about what could be requested, upgraded, and expected without a single word of thanks attached. I told them I was tired, plainly and honestly tired, of being treated like a problem to be managed while I quietly paid for everybody else's idea of a perfect holiday. The call ended about the way you'd guess it would. Nobody apologized outright. A few sharp things got said on both sides. Eventually, the line just went dead, the way these things do when nobody knows how to end a conversation gracefully. But even with the call ending badly, something had shifted that couldn't be shifted back. For the first time in over 2 decades, the weight of that whole operation wasn't sitting on my shoulders anymore, and I noticed, sitting there on Walt's dock, that my shoulders actually felt lighter for it. The days that followed were quiet, quieter than I expected. The messages that trickled in over that first week weren't so different in tone from the phone call. Some anger, some frustration, a couple of half-hearted attempts to make me feel guilty for what I'd done. According to Marcus, I'd humiliated the whole family in front of Renee's parents. According to Renee, I'd created a mess that took hours to sort out, scrambling to find a diner open on Thanksgiving that could seat 11 people on short notice. Patricia mostly stayed out of it, though she texted a few times just to check how I was doing, which was, I noticed, the first time in a very long while that anyone had asked me that particular question without a request attached to the other end of it. As the weeks rolled on, the anger started to cool the way anger usually does when nobody feeds it. Reality settled in behind it. The mountain trip hadn't fallen apart because I'd sabotaged it. It fell apart because, for 22 years, nobody but me had ever once taken responsibility for making sure it actually happened. That distinction mattered, whether anybody in that family wanted to say so out loud or not. Christmas that same year looked different in ways I hadn't expected. Nobody sent links to rental houses. Nobody forwarded gift lists, dressed up as helpful suggestions. Nobody assumed, the way they always had, that I was quietly covering every cost behind the scenes. The old expectation had finally broken. Some things did grow more distant. I won't pretend otherwise. Renee and I still haven't found our way back to easy conversation, and I don't know if we ever fully will. A couple of traditions just faded out entirely, the way traditions sometimes do once nobody's paying to keep them alive artificially. But something else happened too, something I hadn't expected to find on the other side of all that silence. The relationships that survived it started to feel more honest. When Marcus calls me now, it's not because he needs something wired to a rental company by Friday. It's because he wants to talk, sometimes about nothing at all, sometimes about his mother, which he almost never used to bring up before. Those calls aren't frequent, not yet, but they're real in a way the other kind never were. And I'll take one honest phone call over 100 polite requests dressed up as love. Looking back on it now, the best Thanksgiving I've had since I lost Carol wasn't the one with the biggest rental house, or the fanciest caterer, or the raw bar Doug never got to eat from. It was 4 days on a lake with an old friend, a fried turkey on paper plates, and a dog asleep in a patch of sun. It was the one where nobody could find a way to make something my fault. It was the one where I didn't spend a single hour trying to earn anybody's approval, because for once, I wasn't for sale. I've come to believe that real generosity has to have some boundaries built into it, or it isn't generosity at all. It's just obligation wearing a nicer coat. Because the moment kindness turns into an expectation, the gratitude that's supposed to come with it tends to disappear entirely, quiet as smoke. And sometimes the kindest thing a man can do, for himself and for the people who claim to love him, is step back and let them finally carry a little of the weight that was never really his to carry alone. That morning, on the dock, didn't ruin anybody's Thanksgiving. It just finally showed everyone, myself included, who that holiday had actually belonged to all along.